Every time you board a commercial flight, every time you sit down, buckle your seatbelt and pull out your laptop, you are actively participating in the safest mode of transport in human history.
Yeah, it really is staggering when you look at the numbers.
It is, and I want you listening right now to really think about that. Your odds of being involved in a commercial aviation accident sit at an almost incomprehensible, 1 in a million airport movements.
Right, 1 in a million.
Exactly, 1 in a million. But here is the terrifying paradox that brings us to the table today. When a plane does fall out of the sky, when that 1 in a million catastrophe finally happens, 70 to 80% of the time, the machine itself worked perfectly.
Right. The wings didn't snap, the engines didn't fail.
Yeah, the computer didn't crash. 70 to 80% of the time, the root cause is human error. Specifically, a catastrophic lack of good judgment by the people sitting in the front seats.
It's the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah.
I mean, we've reached an era where we have essentially perfected the aluminum, the titanium, the composite materials, and, the digital fly-by-wire systems.
The hardware is basically flawless.
Exactly, nearly flawless.
Yeah.
But the soft biological component, the human being sitting in the left and right seats, is still entirely fallible.
So our mission in this deep dive is to explore that human machine operating the flying machine. We've got this massive stack of aviation, medical, and psychological research here, and we are going to tear into the mind, the biological body, the brutal physics of the upper atmosphere, and, the incredibly complex psychology of the cockpit.
Not a lot to cover.
It is,
Yeah.
because if we're the weakest link, if humans cause the vast majority of accidents, the biggest question I have is, what on earth has kept that accident rate so incredibly low? Like, how do we put flawed humans in a perfect machine and still achieve 1 in a million?
Well, if we're talking strictly about hardware, the short answer is a piece of technology called the Ground Proximity Warning System, or GPWS.
Oh, GPWS, right.
Yeah, honestly, that single system has been the biggest contributor to aviation safety in modern history. It essentially yells at the pilots if they're about to, unknowingly fly a perfectly good airplane into the side of a mountain.
Which used to happen a lot more than people realize.
Exactly. But the longer, much more fascinating answer, which we'll spend this time unpacking, is that the entire aviation industry has been relentlessly re-engineered over the last few decades to assume that humans will make mistakes.
Okay, let's unpack this. If the entire system is built around the assumption that we are going to mess up, we need to understand exactly what a mess up looks like. What is considered a good error rate for a highly trained human being doing a complex task? Like, what's our baseline for failure here?
So a good human error rate, according to the data, is considered to be 1 in 1,000 times.
Wait, 1 in 1,000. Meaning if a pilot flips 1,000 switches, they're statistically going to flip the wrong one at least once.
Yeah, at least once.
Even on a perfect day, even with a full night's sleep.
Precisely that. And when you think about a modern glass cockpit, a pilot is interacting with thousands of data points, switches, radio frequencies, and checklist items on every single flight.
Right.
So, knowing this 1 in 1,000 rule, the aviation industry created a highly specific error classification system to dissect exactly what kinds of mistakes we make. It's not just, oh, they messed up. It's about how the brain failed.
I want to break down those specific flavors of failure. What's the first one?
We start with what is called a fault. This is a scenario where a pilot takes a perfectly good, well-executed action, but with the wrong intention.
Okay.
They executed their plan flawlessly, but their overarching plan was fundamentally flawed from the very start.
So they successfully did the wrong thing. Like they flew a beautiful textbook landing approach, but to the wrong airport.
Exactly. The execution was great, but the intention was disastrous. Next, we have a slip. And this is the exact opposite of a fault.
Okay, how so?
Well, a slip is a wrong action with a good intention. You meant to do the right thing, your plan was perfect, your situational awareness was high, but your finger literally slipped and hit the wrong button on the autopilot panel.
Ah, okay. So a slip is like accidentally putting salt in your coffee when you meant to grab the sugar. You had the right intention, sweeten the coffee, but your hand grabbed the wrong container.
That is a brilliant way to look at it, yeah.
And the scary part about that salt is that your brain often doesn't realize the mistake until you take a sip. But in a cockpit, taking that sip might mean stalling the aircraft.
Yeah, that's the terrifying reality of it. And closely related to the slip is what we call a substitution.
A substitution?
Yeah, this is essentially a very specific type of slip where you substitute one action for another highly similar one, like reaching for the landing gear lever but pulling the flap lever instead just because they are near each other.
Oh, wow.
Then moving on, we have an omission. That one is straightforward but deadly. Simply forgetting to do something. Like you just skipped an item on a pre-flight checklist.
And I guess the opposite of an omission.
That would be a commission. Doing something you absolutely should not do under any circumstances.
Give me an example of that.
The classic example in aviation incident reports is taxiing onto the wrong runway without clearance. You were not supposed to be there, you weren't cleared to be there, but you committed the act anyway.
Now, I'm looking at these definitions and, well, it feels like a lot of blame is being placed on the pilot's brain. But if two levers look identical, aren't we just setting the human up to fail? Some of this has to come down to how the plane is actually built.
You've hit on a massive point in human factors engineering. We have to differentiate between operator-induced errors and design-induced errors.
Right.
The faults, slips, and omissions we just discussed, those generally stem from the individual operator.
Sure.
But design-induced errors come down to poor cockpit ergonomics, bad lighting, or confusing software interfaces.
Which isn't the pilot's fault at all.
Exactly. If an engineer designs two critical toggle switches to look identical and places them a millimeter apart, it is a statistical certainty that a pilot will eventually flip the wrong one.
So to go back to my kitchen analogy, if a slip is grabbing the salt instead of the sugar, a design-induced error is whoever built the kitchen putting the salt and sugar in identical glass jars right next to each other on the exact same shelf.
That is a perfect segue into understanding how accidents gestate, specifically the difference between active and latent errors.
Okay, let's get into that.
So active errors are what you see in the movies. They have immediate dramatic consequences. You pull the wrong lever, the engine shuts down right now. You turn the yoke left when you should have turned right.
Immediate cause and effect.
Right. But latent errors are quiet. They are caused by circumstances or surroundings and are not directly obvious. They are baked into the system long before the pilot even wakes up that morning.
Like the identical jars.
Yes. Your identical salt and sugar jars are a latent error. They might sit there harmlessly for years, just waiting for the right moment of stress or distraction to become an active error.
You know, if you're listening to this on your commute, think about a tricky intersection in your town where the stop sign is hidden behind a tree branch. That hidden sign is a latent error, just waiting for a tired driver to turn it into an active crash.
That's a great real-world example.
So how does an aviation accident actually unfold? Is it usually just one bad slip?
Rarely. The aviation system is way too robust for one active error to bring down a plane. For an accident to happen, multiple active and latent failures must line up perfectly.
The famous Swiss cheese model, right?
Exactly. And the industry maps this out using a framework called TEM, which stands for Threat and Error Management.
TEM.
Right. The chronological pathway to a disaster looks like this. Threats lead to errors, and errors lead to a UAS.
What is a UAS?
An undesired aircraft state. This is an unintended situation that causes severely reduced safety margins. You aren't crashing yet, but you have entered a reality where a crash is suddenly much, much more likely. You're too low, too fast, or dangerously low on fuel.
So let's trace this TEM sequence from the beginning. Imagine a flight from JFK to Heathrow. What constitutes a threat to that crew?
A threat is an external factor that is beyond the flight crew's direct influence. They didn't cause it, but they have to deal with it.
Yeah.
We break these down into two main types.
Okay.
First, environmental threats. This is flying into an unpredicted thunderstorm, encountering severe icing, or receiving a really confusing instruction from air traffic control.
Makes sense.
Second, we have organizational threats. This could be operational pressure from the airline management to stay on schedule despite bad weather, or a manual error in the weight and balance paperwork given to the pilots by the dispatch team.
So the crew is constantly bombarded by these external threats, and they have to manage them. But if their management fails, the threat breaches the cockpit and becomes an error, which is an internal factor, like a flawed action or inaction by the crew themselves.
Correct. And the research categorizes these pilot errors into a few distinct buckets. You have ground navigation errors, like taking that wrong taxiway and ending up nose-to-nose with another jet.
Right.
You have aircraft handling errors, which are very common. This would be flying an unstable approach, like coming in for a landing too fast or too high, or operating the plane outside of its aerodynamic limits.
What if they just push the wrong buttons before takeoff?
That falls under an incorrect configuration error. The flight controls or flaps are set wrong for takeoff, or the mass and balance calculations were entered into the computer incorrectly.
Okay, so ground handling configuration.
Then you have procedural errors, where a pilot simply misses a standard operating procedure, skips an SOP checklist, or makes the wrong verbal call-out to the other pilot. And finally, communication errors, like missing a crucial radio call from air traffic control because they were distracted.
Okay, so threats breach the perimeter, they become errors, and if left unchecked, errors compound into an undesired aircraft state. How do we build a wall to stop this chain reaction?
Through layers of countermeasures, we deploy hard countermeasures, which are physical systems or locked-in software present before the crew even reports for duty.
Like the GPWS we mentioned earlier.
Exactly. The GPWS is a hard countermeasure, or the physical design of a nozzle that physically prevents you from putting the wrong type of fuel into the wing.
Okay.
Then we rely on soft countermeasures, which involve the human contribution dynamically during the flight, cross-checking instruments, communicating clearly, verifying actions with the other pilot.
So the ultimate goal is building a system that is, what, error tolerant?
That is the exact industry term. Error tolerance means designing an entire ecosystem where absolutely no single error can ever cause a catastrophic failure. It deeply respects the reality that humans are fallible.
Right.
But here's where the psychology gets really interesting. The system doesn't just want to eliminate errors, it actually uses them.
But uses them?
Yeah, making a minor error results in a specific cognitive sequence in the brain that helps us adapt our behavior. When we catch a slip, when our finger hits the wrong button and we instantly realize it, our brain learns from that shock, making us hypervigilant and significantly less likely to repeat it in the short term. We use the small errors to calibrate our focus.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You're saying we literally need the small, harmless mistakes to jolt our brains into staying engaged enough to prevent the catastrophic ones. It's like tripping on a crack in the sidewalk. It wakes you up so you don't walk blindly into traffic.
That's a great way to visualize it.
So if the system assumes we will fail, and even relies on small failures to keep us sharp, how does the aviation industry structurally map out this ecosystem around the human to manage it all?
They use a foundational conceptual framework called the Shell model, S-H-E-L. If you want to understand aviation safety, you have to understand Shell. It maps out the entire web of interactions required for a safe flight.
Let's break down the Shell acronym. What are the components?
The S stands for software. But we need to be careful here in this specific model. Software doesn't primarily mean computer code.
Oh, it doesn't?
No, it refers to the non-physical, conceptual aspects of the system. The rules, checklists, training manuals, standard operating procedures, even the unwritten cultural norms of the airline.
Got it.
The H is for hardware. These are all the solid physical objects the human interacts with, the physical aircraft itself, the instruments, the seats, the flight controls.
The actual machine.
Right. The E is for environment. This encompasses the varying external factors through which the aircraft operates: the weather, the altitude, the air traffic control environment, the layout of the runway.
And the L?
The L is for liveware, the human being, the pilot. But the trick to the Shell diagram is that liveware actually appears twice.
Wait, twice? How does that work?
It sits right in the center cross, representing the pilot interacting with the software, the hardware, and the environment. But it also represents liveware interacting with liveware, the human-to-human interface, the pilot communicating with the co-pilot, the cabin crew, the mechanics on the ground.
I see. So if a pilot is deeply confused by a poorly written, ambiguous checklist, we wouldn't just call that human error. We would classify that as a liveware software mismatch.
Yes, exactly. And our sources are very specific about this. They define a liveware software mismatch as representing a, quote, conceptual aspects of systems mismatch.
What does that mean in plain English?
It essentially means the human brain is rejecting or failing to mesh with the conceptual rules and logic laid out for it. The manual was written by an engineer in an office, but it doesn't make intuitive sense to a stressed pilot in a thunderstorm.
You know, if I'm looking at the Shell model, it sounds like ensuring this massive web of interactions works smoothly isn't just on the pilot's shoulders.
It absolutely cannot be. A core tenet of modern aviation is that everyone is responsible for safety as individuals. It's not just the people in the cockpit. It's the baggage handlers ensuring the cargo is balanced. It's the mechanics turning the wrenches. It's the dispatchers calculating the fuel. Every single piece of liveware in the system must possess the correct KSA.
KSA. Define that for me.
Knowledge, skills, and attitudes. You can have the textbook knowledge of how to fix a jet engine, and you can possess the physical tactile skill to actually turn the wrench and safety wire the bolts. But if your attitude is careless, if you are rushing to get off shift, the system fails. Attitude is the glue.
Which brings us to the concept of safety culture. If an individual's attitude matters that much, the overarching culture of the airline must be the invisible hand guiding everything.
It is the invisible hand, yeah. But we have to recognize that an airline's safety culture does not exist in a vacuum. It is a subset of, and heavily dictated by, the national culture of the country where the airline operates.
That makes sense.
The way a society collectively views authority, hierarchy, and rule following directly impacts the safety culture of its pilots. If you come from a culture where you never question an elder or a superior, a young co-pilot might watch an older captain make a fatal mistake and stay completely silent out of cultural respect.
Wow, so cultural deference can literally be a latent error. What does a healthy engineered safety culture actually look like then?
A strong safety culture is universally defined by 5 distinct traits. First, it must be an informed culture.
Informed, meaning the pilots are well trained and know how to fly.
Much deeper than that. The renowned human factors expert James Reason defines an informed culture specifically as one that actively gathers information from accidents, near misses, and routine flight data. They don't just react, they hunt for data.
Okay, proactive.
Second, and heavily tied to the first, it must be a reporting culture. People at all levels must feel safe reporting their own mistakes and close calls without terror of retribution.
Which naturally brings us to the third trait, right? You can't have a reporting culture if people are terrified of being fired for raising their hand.
Precisely. That is why the third pillar is a just culture. In a just culture, genuine mistakes are not punished.
Okay, I want to push back on this because if you're listening to this, you might be thinking what I'm thinking. Does this mean pilots just get away with everything? If I make a mistake at my job, I get in trouble. If a pilot makes a mistake that puts 300 lives at risk, surely someone has to get fired, right? Is there a line between a genuine mistake and gross negligence?
There is a very firm, legally defined line. A just culture is emphatically not a no-blame culture.
No.
If a pilot intentionally violates a known safety rule, if they come to work intoxicated, or if they act with reckless disregard for human life, they are absolutely punished, fired, or even prosecuted.
As they should be.
Right. But if a pilot makes an honest slip or an omission, despite trying to do the right thing if they were fatigued or confused by a bad checklist, they are protected. Why? Because if you punish honest mistakes, people simply stop reporting them. The errors get buried, the organization goes blind, and the airline stops learning.
Which is the fourth trait, a learning culture.
Yes. Action must be taken on the gathered data. If 50 different pilots report that a specific checklist is confusing, a learning culture doesn't just file those reports away, they actually rewrite the checklist.
Makes total sense.
And finally, the fifth trait is a flexible culture. The organization must be agile enough to implement those solutions and adapt to new information quickly without being bogged down by infinite bureaucracy.
It sounds to me like the fundamental difference between an open culture and a closed culture.
That's the perfect summary. In an open culture, people share their knowledge, their fears, and their thoughts freely. In a closed culture, there is fear, a rigid hierarchy, and a lack of incentive towards sharing. In a closed culture, latent errors remain perfectly hidden in the shadows until they align to cause an accident.
Okay, so we've built this massive, perfectly balanced safety ecosystem around the human. The shell model is optimized, the just culture is in place. But eventually, that soft biological human has to take this incredibly complex hardware and fly it into the environment. And the environment, the upper atmosphere, is physically brutally hostile to our biology. Let's transition from the psychology of the system to the physical reality the LIBOR is flying through.
Right. To truly grasp the human limitations in aviation, we have to understand the brutal physics of the atmosphere. Let's look at the composition of the air around us. From the surface all the way up to 100 kilometers above the Earth, the proportions of the gases stay remarkably constant. The atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 0.95% other gases, and 0.03% carbon dioxide.
Wait, 21% oxygen? I think most people, myself included, assume the oxygen level drops as you go higher. That's why it's hard to breathe on a mountain, right?
It's a very, very common misconception. The percentage of oxygen is exactly the same at 40,000 feet as it is at sea level. It is still 21%.
So what changes?
What changes the pressure? The air just gets incredibly thin. We divide the atmosphere into 3 operational zones based on this pressure drop.
Yeah.
From mean sea level up to 10,000 feet is the physiological zone. This is where human bodies are evolutionarily designed to live, breathe, and function. without any technological help.
And once we climb above 10,000 feet?
From 10,000 feet up to 60,000 feet is the physiological deficient zone. We simply cannot survive here long-term without supplemental oxygen or a mechanically pressurized cabin.
Okay.
At above 60,000 feet is the space equivalent zone. Up there, the pressure is so low that without a full-body pressure suit, the gases dissolved in your bodily fluids would literally begin to boil at normal body temperature.
Okay, that is deeply terrifying. So how fast does this environment become hostile as a plane climbs?
We measure this environmental degradation through lapse rates. Let's look at pressure first. The barometric pressure drops by 1 hectopascal for every 27 feet you climb up until you hit 18,000 feet.
And then?
Above 18,000 feet, the air is already so thin that it drops 1 hectopascal for every 50 feet. For temperature, it is a steady freeze. The temperature drops 2 degrees Celsius for every 1,000 feet you climb until you hit 36,000 feet, where it stabilizes at an incredibly cold minus 56.5 degrees Celsius.
Minus 56.5.
Yeah. And above 36,000 feet, the temperature becomes isothermal, meaning it stays relatively constant for a while.
So as a passenger on a normal commercial flight, I'm sitting in a thin metal tube where it's minus 56 Celsius, just a few inches from my elbow. What about the pressure? I want to understand exactly why we can't breathe up there.
Let's look at the raw numbers, because they are the key to understanding human performance failure. At sea level, standard atmospheric barometric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury, or mmHg. At this total pressure, the partial pressure of oxygen, which is the specific physical force driving oxygen molecules into your bloodstream, is roughly 103 millimeter Hg.
Okay, baseline established. 760 total pressure, 103 of that is the oxygen pushing its way into my lungs.
Now, the barometric pressure decrease is actually greatest in the first few thousand feet, from 0 to 5,000 feet. By the time you reach the top of the physiological zone at 10,000 feet, the total pressure is dropped from 760 down to 500 millimeter Hg. That is almost half the driving force of oxygen lost just at 10,000 feet. No wonder hikers get winded.
It gets much more extreme as a jet climbs. At 18,000 feet, the total pressure halves to roughly 380 millimeter Hg. At 27,000 feet, the pressure drops to 1/3 of sea level. At 34,000 feet, it drops to 1/4, which is about 190 millimeter Hg. And by the time a corporate jet reaches 45,000 feet, the pressure is a mere 1/8 of what it is at sea level. Think about that for a second. At 18,000 feet, half the entire mass of the Earth's atmosphere is physically beneath you. You are above half the air on the planet. How does the biological human body even begin to cope with that?
It doesn't cope well at all, because our bodies are rigidly governed by the gas laws. These are the fundamental laws of physics that dictate how gases behave under changing temperatures and pressures. When you put a human in a low-pressure environment, these laws turn the body against itself.
We have to break these down. And I know physics can be dry, so let's translate these into what they actually do to a pilot. What are the laws?
There are 6 critical ones we must define, and they are foundational to aviation medicine. First is Charles's law. Volume is directly proportional to temperature, assuming constant pressure. If you heat a gas, it expands.
That one makes sense. It's the physics behind a hot air balloon. Heat the air, it expands, the balloon rises.
Exactly. Second is Boyle's law. And I have to pause here, because it is phrased very strangely in these specific aviation medical literature we are sourcing. The text states exactly this. Pressure is proportional to 1 over temperature, assuming a constant temperature.
Wait. Pressure is proportional to 1 over temperature at a constant temperature. That feels like a typo in the physics book. It's a direct contradiction.
It certainly sounds like one. What it's actually doing in this specific documentation is trying to highlight the inverse relationship between pressure and volume, using temperature as the baseline constant. Practically speaking, what Boyle's law means for a pilot is that as environmental pressure decreases, the volume of a trapped gas expands.
Ah, okay. So imagine taking a sealed bag of potato chips on a flight. As the cabin pressure drops during the climb, the air inside the bag expands until it looks like a balloon. That exact same physics is going to wreak havoc on any microscopic pockets of gas trapped inside a pilot's body.
Precisely. Next is the general gas law, which simply combines them mathematically. Pressure times volume divided by temperature equals a constant. Then we have Dalton's law. In a mixture of gases, the total pressure is simply the sum of the individual partial pressures. This explains the oxygen paradox we discussed.
Right. The percentage of oxygen is still 21% at 40,000 feet, but because the total atmospheric pie is so much smaller, the oxygen slice provides far less absolute pressure to push into your blood.
Exactly. Then there is Fick's law, which governs how gases actually cross biological membranes, like in our lungs. The rate of diffusion depends on the surface area available and the differential pressure between the two sides of the membrane. Finally, we have Henry's law. The quantity of a gas dissolved into a liquid is proportional to the partial pressure of that gas over the liquid.
Okay, Henry's law. So if the atmospheric pressure drops rapidly, gases that were safely dissolved in a liquid will suddenly undissolve and bubble out, like opening a shaken can of soda.
Exactly like opening a soda can. Now, to truly understand how these physics laws conspire to incapacitate a pilot, we need to connect this hostile outside atmosphere to the internal engine of the human body.
The liveware. Let's talk about the human body as a mechanical engine. How does respiration actually work under the hood?
Let's trace the mechanical path of a single breath. Air enters through the oral nasal passage, moves down the pharynx, passes the larynx, goes down the trachea, branches out into the bronchi, and finally terminates in the alveoli, which are millions of tiny balloon-like air sacs deep in the lungs where the actual gas exchange happens.
And how much air we're moving through this intake manifold?
A normal human breathing rate is roughly 10 to 15 cycles per minute, though at complete rest it can range from 12 to 20, averaging about 16 breaths per minute. The volume of a normal resting breath, what we call tidal volume, is about 500 milliliters. But your lungs have massive reserve capacity. Your inspiratory volume, which is how much you can take in during a massive deep breath, is about 3,300 milliliters. Your expiratory volume, how much you can forcefully push out beyond a normal breath, is 1,000 milliliters. And crucially, you always have a residual volume of roughly 1,200 milliliters of air that never leaves the lungs, which keeps them from collapsing like a deflated balloon.
So we take in air that is 21% oxygen. What comes out the exhaust pipe?
Exhaled air is roughly 15% oxygen and 4% carbon dioxide. Our bodies extract a portion of the oxygen for fuel and replace it with CO2 waste. But here is the crucial biological mechanic that most people, even many pilots, get fundamentally wrong.
What's that?
Your breathing rate is not controlled by a lack of oxygen. It is controlled by the pressure of carbon dioxide in your blood.
If you're listening to this on a run right now, huffing and puffing, stop and think about this. My brain isn't screaming for oxygen when I hold my breath. It's actively panicking about the waste CO2 building up. That is totally backwards to how we usually think about survival.
It is entirely counterintuitive. You have a respiratory control center in your brain that constantly monitors the blood. When CO2 levels rise, receptor cells trigger the sensation of shortness of breath and an increased breathing rate to flush the waste out. Your body is a CO2 management system, not an oxygen-seeking system.
So how does the oxygen actually get from those little alveoli sacs into the blood?
This is where Fick's law and Dalton's law take over. Gas exchange happens purely through partial pressures. Inside the alveoli, the partial pressure of CO2 is about 40 millimillimeter Hg, but the dark, venous blood arriving at the lungs from the rest of the body has a much higher CO2 pressure. Because physics dictates that gases always move from high pressure to low pressure, the CO2 naturally jumps from the blood into the lungs to be exhaled.
And the oxygen jumps the other way, like walking from a crowded room into an empty hallway.
Yes. Inside the alveoli, you also have 47 millimillimeter Hg of water vapor and about 100 millimillimeter Hg of oxygen. Because the blood arriving from the body is depleted and lacks oxygen, the O2 diffuses from the high pressure of the alveoli directly into the low pressure of the blood.
Okay, so the lungs are the intake manifold. What about the fuel pump, the circulatory system?
Blood is composed of 45% cells, including the vital red blood cells that carry the gases, and 55% plasma, which is the liquid medium. Before it reaches the lungs for exchange, it is lacking oxygen and rich in CO2. The heart is the mechanical pump driving this fluid. We have sensors called pressure receptors located in the carotid and aortic arterial vessels that constantly monitor blood pressure to keep the system balanced.
What kind of performance numbers is the human heart putting out?
Cardiac output is defined as the blood quantity pumped per minute. It equals the volume pumped per individual beat multiplied by the beats per minute. On average, a healthy human heart pumps about 5 liters of blood per minute. A normal resting pulse for an adult is 60 to 80 beats per minute, and normal arterial blood pressure is 120 over 80 millimillimeter Hg.
And if those numbers are out of whack, the engine is in trouble.
Exactly. If you have constantly increased pressure on the arterial walls, that is hypertension. The heart itself is a muscle and also needs fuel, which it gets from the coronary arteries. If those specific arteries narrow, reducing oxygen to the heart muscle itself, you get a painful symptom called angina. And if a coronary artery gets totally blocked, causing the actual death of a piece of the heart muscle, that is a heart attack. Medically, this is most common for people over 40 years old.
One environmental factor up high is extreme cold. We mentioned minus 56 Celsius earlier. Does temperature affect this human engine?
Yes, significantly. Hypothermia, or the core body getting too cold, initially causes a massive increased demand for oxygen. As the body shivers and burns energy to generate heat, it puts vastly more strain on the respiratory and circulatory systems, burning fuel faster.
Okay, so we have a detailed picture of how the human engine works on the ground. But what happens when we take this delicate engine and fly it into that physiological deficient zone we talked about? Let's get into the nightmare that is high altitude medicine.
The primary, most lethal enemy at high altitude is hypoxia, a severe lack of sufficient oxygen to the brain and body tissues.
At what altitude does this become a real physiological danger?
Hypoxia generally does not occur below 3,000 meters, which is roughly 10,000 feet. But once you cross that 10,000-foot threshold, the partial pressure of oxygen drops below the critical value of 55 millimilli Hg. At this point, even though there's still 21% oxygen in the air, there simply isn't enough atmospheric weight to force it into your blood effectively.
Let's roleplay this. Say I am a pilot cruising at 35,000 feet and a cargo door blows out. The plane explosively decompresses. The cabin instantly becomes the outside atmosphere. What happens to my brain?
We measure your survival using a metric called TUC, time of useful consciousness. This is a critical distinction. It isn't how long until you biologically die. It's how long until your brain is so starved of oxygen that you can no longer make a rational, life-saving decision. You might be awake, but you're effectively a zombie.
Run down the TUC times for me. How fast does the clock tick?
It is terrifyingly fast. At 25,000 feet, you have 3 to 5 minutes of useful consciousness.
Oh, wow. 3 to 5 minutes.
Right. At 30,000 feet, it drops drastically to between 45 seconds and 1.5 minutes. At 35,000 feet, you have 30 to 60 seconds, averaging about 45 seconds. And if you are in a modern jet at 43,000 feet, you have a mere 30 to 45 seconds before you are incapacitated.
Less than a minute to realize what's happening, recognize the alarm, secure your oxygen mask, and initiate a massive emergency descent.
Exactly. And your body does try to warn you, but the signs are subtle. At 7,000 feet, you cross the reaction threshold, where compensatory reactions quietly start your heart rate and breathing increase slightly without you noticing. The disturbance threshold is between 10,000 and 12,000 feet, where you start feeling actual cognitive effects like mild euphoria or sluggishness. The critical threshold is 22,000 feet or 20,000 feet in a non-pressurized aircraft. Beyond that, physical collapse is imminent without supplemental oxygen.
So the alarm blares, they slap on an oxygen mask. Does breathing 100% pure oxygen instantly fix the problem?
Up to a certain altitude, yes. Because remember Dalton's law. Total pressure matters. If you are breathing 100% oxygen at 33,700 feet, the partial pressure of that pure oxygen is roughly 103 millimilli Hg, which is exactly equivalent to breathing normal 21% air standing at sea level.
Okay, so a mask supplying pure oxygen at 33,700 feet makes your lungs feel like they're standing on the beach.
Right. But watch what happens as you climb higher. Breathing 100% pure oxygen at 38,000 feet only provides enough pressure to simulate breathing normal air at 8,000 feet. Breathing 100% oxygen at 40,000 feet feels like breathing normal air at 10,000 feet. You hit that critical 55 millimilli Hg threshold all over again. In fact, if you go to 38,000 to 40,000 feet, hypoxia will occur even if you are breathing 100% oxygen, unless that oxygen is actively forced into your lungs under physical pressure.
That is absolutely mind-blowing. At 40,000 feet, breathing pure, unadulterated oxygen isn't enough to keep you conscious because the atmosphere is so thin it can't push the oxygen across the membrane of your lungs.
Yeah, it's wild.
But hypoxia isn't the only demon up there. What about Boyle's Law, the expanding bag of potato chips?
That leads to a condition called dysbarism, which is extreme, debilitating pain caused by trapped expanding gases. As the cabin pressure drops during a climb, any gas trapped inside your body expands. This affects the stomach, ears, sinuses, and incredibly, the teeth.
Wait, teeth? How does gas get in your teeth?
If you have a microscopic air bubble trapped underneath an old cavity filling or dental work, the expanding gas has nowhere to go. It presses directly against the dental nerve, causing agonizing pain. In the stomach and intestines, the expansion causes severe pain that is highly prevalent above 25,000 feet. The only way to relieve it is by belching or passing flatus.
Not exactly the glamorous Top Gun image of a pilot, but highly biologically necessary to avoid incapacitation. What about the ears?
The middle ear is connected to the back of the throat by a tiny passage called the eustachian tube. If you are flying with a head cold and that eustachian tube is blocked by mucus, equalization of pressure is severely limited. This is especially dangerous on fast descents. As the plane descends, the outside pressure increases and pushes violently against the trapped lower pressure in your inner ear. This causes intense stabbing pain and can result in severe eardrum damage or rupture.
And then there's Henry's Law. The shaken soda can affect.
Yes, decompression sickness or DCS. As pressure drops, nitrogen gas that is normally safely dissolved in your blood and tissues undissolves and bubbles out. These bubbles travel through the bloodstream and form blockages, potentially leading to tissue death. The primary symptom is severe, crippling joint pain, commonly known as the bends. This physiological trap is sometimes colloquially referred to in aviation medical notes as Henry's hole, pointing at the danger created by Henry's law.
And to prevent DCS, pilots have strict rules about scuba diving, right? Because diving forces extra nitrogen into your blood under pressure.
Exactly. You must wait a full 24 hours after scuba diving before taking a flight. Even without diving, if a pilot suffers an episode of DCS during an altitude chamber test or a flight, they must wait 12 hours before their next duty period to ensure all the nitrogen is cleared.
This all sounds incredibly physically strenuous. If the body is fighting this hard just to exist, a pilot's baseline health must play a massive role. How do diet and lifestyle choices impact a pilot's physiology in the air?
Immensely. Let's start with body mass. The industry uses a standard BMI formula, weight in kilograms divided by height in meters squared. The only caveat in the literature is that for females, you subtract 1 from the final calculation.
And what are the medical thresholds?
Under 18.5 is considered underweight. 18.5 to 25 is normal. 25 to 30 is overweight. Above 30 is classified as obese. Obesity is generally caused by high caloric intake and leads to high fat levels, which result in poor circulation, coronary problems, type 2 diabetes, and arthritis. But specific to the aviation environment, obesity is incredibly dangerous. It causes a reduced tolerance to hypoxia, a reduced tolerance to decompression sickness because nitrogen loves to dissolve in fat tissue, and a significantly low tolerance to G-forces.
Wow, so being overweight actually makes you physically more susceptible to the bends and blacking out in a turn. What about daily diet? Can a pilot skip breakfast before an early flight?
They really shouldn't. A healthy breakfast should provide 25% of a person's daily caloric intake. If a pilot skips meals, they risk hypoglycemia, which is a dangerous drop in blood sugar. This causes dizziness, fainting, headaches, and a severe lack of concentration. The solution is a balanced diet and eating small snacks between meals to keep blood sugar stable.
What about the pilot's best friend, coffee? I imagine they drink a lot of it on red-eye flights.
Caffeine is a central nervous system stimulant and a vasodilator. In small amounts, it is helpful. It improves alertness, thought processes, and muscle coordination. But there is a hard limit. If a pilot consumes more than 250 milligrams of caffeine, which isn't that much, maybe 2 large, strong coffees' performance actually degrades. It causes muscle tremors, rapid heart rate, excessive urination, and irritability.
Let's talk about the more heavily regulated substances, alcohol and smoking.
Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. It severely degrades judgment, lowers G tolerance, and ruins paradoxical sleep, meaning you wake up exhausted. Even a microscopic amount, a blood alcohol level of 0.05%, causes a noticeable slight lack of coordination.
What are the strict aviation limits?
The baseline rule is absolutely no alcohol can be consumed in the 8 hours prior to a flight duty period or standby. But the European Authority, EASA, has a limit that is incredibly strict, 20 milligrams of alcohol per 100 milliliters of the blood. To calculate sobering up, the average human metabolism rate of alcohol is 0.01 to 0.015 grams per 100 grams per hour, which equates to roughly 15 milligrams per 100 milliliters per hour.
There is a random old wives' tale myth I've heard that having a drink before a flight makes your ears pop better.
It is a complete myth. The medical data is clear. Alcohol does not promote barotrauma relief. It just makes you impaired and dehydrated.
And smoking, obviously it's bad for you, but what does it do at 10,000 feet?
Smoking is uniquely terrible for pilots. It artificially lifts the pilot's physiological altitude. If a smoker is flying in a pressurized cabin at 10,000 feet, the oxygen content in their blood actually acts as if they are at a much higher altitude. This is because smoking causes hypochemic, also known as anemic hypoxia.
Because of the carbon monoxide in the cigarette smoke?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Carbon monoxide's affinity to bind to the hemoglobin in your blood is 210 to 250 times higher than oxygen. It essentially violently hijacks the red blood cells, locking oxygen out. Smoking just 1 pack of cigarettes means you lose 5 to 8% of your body's total oxygen transportation capacity.
So with all these vulnerabilities, obesity, blood sugar, oxygen capacity, the medical authorities must keep a very tight leash on pilots.
They do. Pilots are regularly evaluated and given medical dispositions, fit, unfit, or referred. A pilot must immediately seek advice from an aeromedical examiner, or AME, if they're admitted to a hospital for more than 12 hours, undergo any surgical or invasive procedure, or begin the regular use of any medication or correcting lenses.
Are there life events they have to formally report in writing?
Yes, they must advise the aviation authority in writing for any significant personal injury, any illness lasting more than 21 days, or pregnancy.
What about something altruistic, like donating blood? Can a pilot give blood on their day off?
There is a strict no-flying period of 24 hours after a blood donation, because removing a pint of blood dramatically decreases your red blood cell count and severely increases your susceptibility to hypoxia. If you undergo the more intense procedure of donating bone marrow, it is a 48-hour no-fly period.
Okay, there are a few other highly specific, somewhat bizarre hazards I want to touch on from our sources. First, obvious versus partial incapacitation in the cockpit. Which is worse?
Strangely enough, obvious incapacitation, like a pilot having a sudden massive heart attack and slumping over the controls, is actually considered the least dangerous type of medical emergency in a multi-crew cockpit.
Wait, really? A heart attack is less dangerous?
Because it is spotted immediately by the other crew member. The co-pilot instantly knows they are alone, they take control, declare an emergency, and land. A partially incapacitated pilot, someone who is sick with food poisoning, dizzy, or confused, but still trying to push buttons and fly, is incredibly dangerous. They might fight the other pilot for control or make subtle, deadly inputs that go unnoticed. The rule is simple and absolute. A partially incapacitated pilot should not fly, and the other pilot must take over completely.
That actually perfectly explains a very specific rule here that caught my eye crews eating different meals. It sounds like a quirky airline tradition, but it's deeply rooted in preventing dual partial incapacitation, right?
Absolutely. If possible, the crew should always eat different meals provided by the catering company. If the fish is bad and causes food poisoning, you only lose one pilot to partial incapacitation, not both.
Smart. A couple of other bizarre chemical hazards on the list, mercury and soap. Explain those.
Mercury is strictly prohibited on all aircraft because it is highly reactive with aluminum. If a pilot drops an old-school mercury thermometer and it spills, the mercury will literally amalgamate and eat a hole straight through the aluminum floor structure of the plane.
Oh, wow. Just eat right through it.
Yeah, it's terrible. As for soap, in certain chemical cleaning or aircraft maintenance scenarios, you should not initially use soap to clean your hands, with one specific exception. You can use it if you are washing off aviation fuel.
And radiation. You are flying closer to the sun, so you get exposed to more up high, right?
Yes. Cosmic radiation increases significantly at higher latitudes and higher altitudes. Airlines actually keep detailed records of radiation exposure for crews operating flights above 29,000 feet. By the way, to understand radiation types, alpha radiation is very weak and can be absorbed by a single thin piece of paper or just 0.2 centimeters of water. But higher up in the atmosphere, you also deal with ozone, which handily absorbs harmful UVB radiation much better than UVA. And just to throw in one more piece of atmospheric physics for the pilots, if the temperature increases in a parcel of air, the relative humidity decreases.
All right, so the biological engine is fueled. It's operating within its physical limits. We've avoided the bad fish and the mercury. But how does the brain actually interpret the outside world through the senses? We've talked about the hardware. Now let's talk about the sensors. Spoiler alert for the listener, your senses lie to you constantly.
They lie constantly and convincingly. Let's start with sight, which provides a massive 70 to 75% of all our knowledge and orientation during flight. The eye works essentially like a mechanical camera. The iris controls the size and diameter of the pupil, and the pupil controls the amount of light that strikes the back of the eye. The eye focuses through a muscular process called accommodation.
Where is our vision the sharpest? Like, where is the HD camera located?
At a tiny spot on the retina called the fovea. Your visual acuity is best within a tiny 2 to 3 degree cone of the fovea, right in the center of your vision. Outside of that 3-degree cone, visual acuity reduces rapidly in your periphery. But vision has major biological limits in the air. Night vision degradation begins at just 5,000 feet or 1,500 meters due to mild hypoxia. The light-sensing cells in the eye are highly oxygen-dependent, so as oxygen drops, your night vision dims.
And even when we have enough oxygen and we can see clearly, we suffer from visual illusions. The source material divides these into top-down and bottom-up illusions. What is the difference between my brain being tricked top-down versus bottom-up?
By definition, when there is a difference between what is perceived by the brain and what is physical reality, that is an illusion. Bottom-up illusions come directly from flawed, raw sensory information. For example, if you're flying low over very tall trees for 10 miles and then suddenly fly over a patch of short, stunted trees, your raw sensory input tricks your brain into thinking you've suddenly gained altitude, even if you are perfectly level.
Okay, so that's bottom up.
Right. Top-down illusions, however, come from experience and expectation. They prove that perception varies wildly between individuals. For example, if there is dust or haze in the air reducing visibility, it makes objects of equal size and distance appear smaller or further away, simply because your brain's experience tells it that hazy things are distant.
Let's walk through some specific dangerous visual illusions. Put me in the cockpit. What happens if a pilot is landing in fog or mist?
In fog or mist, the moisture scatters the light, making the runway lights appear dimmer. Your brain interprets dim as far away. So objects appear further away than they actually are. The pilot looks out, thinks I'm too far back, so they instinctively fly a steeper approach to get closer and end up making a long landing, floating dangerously way past the touchdown zone.
Now walk me through the black hole effect. As a pilot, my eyes are telling me one thing, but gravity and the altimeter are telling me another. Which one wins if I'm not careful?
If you aren't careful, the eyes win, and that is deadly. The black hole effect happens when flying over water or completely featureless, dark terrain at night on the approach to a brightly lit airfield. Because the runway lights are the only thing you can see, the total lack of peripheral visual cues creates a powerful illusion that the aircraft is at a higher altitude than it really is. The pilot looks out, feels they are too high, so they drop the nose, fly a low approach, and risk crashing directly into the water or terrain short of the runway.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, any approach at night with no landing aids makes a pilot falsely think they are higher than actual.
Runways themselves can play visual tricks too, right? Because we expect them to be perfectly flat and a standard width.
Yes, runway illusions are a classic top-down problem based on the brain expecting a standard geometric shape. If a runway is upsloping, meaning it goes uphill, the pilot's visual perspective makes them believe they're too high. They correct by flying a steeper approach and often land short or hit the ground hard. If the runway is downsloping, the pilot feels low, flies a higher approach, and makes a long landing, risking running off the end.
What about the width of the runway? If I usually land at massive international airports and suddenly land at a small regional strip?
If a runway is narrower than what the pilot is used to, the visual perspective makes the pilot believe they are too high. This leads to them flying a flatter than normal approach, creating a tendency to undershoot the runway and initiating the landing flare too late, smashing into the tarmac. Conversely, if a runway is wider than usual, the pilot thinks they are too low. They fly a high approach, overshoot, or initiate an early, high round-out flare, stalling the plane and dropping it hard onto the runway.
That covers sight, which is 70% of the battle. What about hearing?
Hearing provides about 13% of our situational knowledge. Biologically, we can hear frequencies between 20 and 20,000 hertz. For context, the human ear optimally listens to audio at around 500 hertz, but human speech is generated much lower, around 125 hertz.
And the cockpit of a commercial jet is incredibly loud.
Yes, and noise effects depend on three specific factors: the loudness of the sound, the length of exposure, and the frequency. Noise can be categorized as steady state, like the continuous droning hum of the jet engines, or impulse, which is a sudden, sharp, loud bang.
Give us the quick anatomy of the ear because it plays a huge role not just in hearing, but in the terrifying physical illusions we are about to discuss.
The human ear is divided into three parts. The outer ear consists of the auricle, or pinna, the fleshy part, you can touch the auditory canal, and the eardrum, which is medically called the tympanic membrane. The middle ear houses the ossicles, which are tiny, delicate bones that transmit vibration. The inner ear contains the cochlea for hearing and the eustachian tube we discussed earlier for pressure equalization.
But the inner ear isn't just a microphone. It's our primary balance center.
Exactly. And to understand balance in an aircraft, we first have to talk about proprioception, what pilots call the seat of the pants feeling. You have subcutaneous receptors that sense pressure on your skin, and proprioceptors in your muscles, tendons, and joints that constantly sense the relative motion and position of your body parts.
So if the plane accelerates and pushes me deep into my seat back, I feel that pressure and my brain translates it as climbing.
You feel the physical acceleration, yes. But here is the deadly trap. Proprioception is only useful when flying in VMC, visual meteorological conditions. That means when you can clearly see the real horizon outside the window to verify the feeling. If you fly into a cloud, the seat of the pants feeling will actively, maliciously try to kill you.
Because of the vestibular system.
Yes. The vestibular system located in the inner ear measures linear and radial accelerations. The critical, fatal limitation of this biological system is that it senses rate of change, not sustained change.
Break that down. How does a tiny organ in my ear measure changes in 3D space?
You have two distinct sets of organs in there. The sacculus and the utriculus measure gravity and linear acceleration, speeding up or slowing down in a straight line. Then you have the semicircular canals. There are three of them, perfectly aligned for each axis of 3D space. Roll, pitch, and yaw. They're filled with fluid. When you bank the aircraft into a turn, the fluid in these canals moves. Tiny hairs in the canal sense this fluid motion, stimulating the vestibular nerve, which transmits electrical impulses to the brain saying, "We are turning."
And this is where G-forces come into play, pushing on that fluid in our blood.
Yes, G-forces are simply severe accelerations, and a pilot's physical tolerance to them depends on their blood sugar, obesity, and hypoxia levels. We categorize G-forces strictly by the direction they apply force to the body.
If I've seen Top Gun, I know pulling up hard drains the blood from your head. But what happens if you brake hard or get shoved forward? Does the brain react differently to horizontal forces? Give me the breakdown of the G-force axis.
It absolutely reacts differently. Plus, G's is positive radial G-force, like pulling up violently from a dive or doing a loop. This is the most significant and famous for pilots because it pushes blood straight down away from the brain and into the legs, leading to loss of vision and blackouts. G's is negative radial G-force, like pushing the nose down hard into a dive, forcing blood violently up into the head, causing redouts.
What about the horizontal ones?
Plus, GX is transverse forwards. This is the heavy pressure you feel on your chest, pushing you into the seat during a powerful takeoff. JDGX is transverse backwards, the feeling of braking hard or hitting a wall. JDGX is notorious for confusing the inner ear and creating intense sensory illusions. Finally, there's G, which is lateral or sideways G-force, but this is quite rare in normal, coordinated flight.
So when these G-forces and accelerations confuse the fluid in the semicircular canals, we get 3D illusions, and these are the ones that cause catastrophic, perfectly functional planes to crash. Explain the leans.
The leans, technically called the somatodral illusion, happen when you enter a very slow, highly gradual turn in the clouds. Imagine holding a shallow bowl of water. If you turn very, very slowly, the water doesn't slosh, it just moves with the bowl. In your ear, the fluid starts moving so slowly that the sensory hairs simply don't detect the motion. Your brain firmly believes you are flying straight and level, but you are actually banked in a turn. When you finally check the instruments, realize you are banking, and suddenly roll back to perfectly level flight, the sudden motion causes the fluid to violently slosh the other way. Your brain suddenly screams that you are banking sharply in the opposite direction. Even though the instruments say you are level, the pilot feels an overwhelming physical compulsion to lean physically into the original turn just to feel upright.
That is terrifying. What about the Coriolis effect or vertigo?
That is caused by the simultaneous stimulation of several semicircular canals at once. If you are in a sustained turn, the fluid in one canal is moving. If you suddenly snap your head down to pick up a dropped pen or look at a chart, you stimulate a second axis while the first is already active. The brain gets completely overwhelmed by the conflicting signals and creates a violent, sickening, tumbling sensation.
And the graveyard spin. That sounds exactly as terrifying as it is. Put me in the pilot seat for this one.
It is a deadly psychological loop. Imagine a pilot gets disoriented in a cloud and accidentally enters a downward spin. At first, they feel the spin. But after a few seconds of spinning, the fluid in the ears eventually catches up with the rotation and stabilizes. The sensory hairs stop bending. The pilot suddenly stops feeling the spin, even though they are plummeting toward the earth.
So they think they are flying straight down, not spinning.
Yes. When they look at the instruments, realize they are spinning, and apply the rudder to forcefully recover and stop the spin, the aircraft stops rotating. But the fluid in the ear decelerates and sloshes in the opposite direction. This creates a powerful, overwhelming somatoviral illusion that they have just entered a brand new spin in the opposite direction.
Oh no.
Yes, panicking, feeling like they are spinning out of control again, the pilot aggressively applies corrective action to stop this fake spin. But because the fake spin is an illusion, their correction forces the aircraft right back into the original, real, deadly spin. They spin all the way to the ground.
Wow. Your own biological senses trick you into actively killing yourself? Is there a pitch illusion too, where you think you are climbing but you aren't?
Yes, the cinematographic illusion. This is the overwhelming illusion of tumbling backwards. When an aircraft accelerates very rapidly, like during a go-around on a missed approach, the sacculus and utriculus organs in the ear get pushed back by the plus jickets force. The brain interprets this linear acceleration exactly the same way it interprets pitching the nose straight up into a steep climb. The pilot genuinely feels they are climbing at a dangerously steep angle and about to stall, so they aggressively push the nose down, often flying a perfectly good airplane right into the ground or the ocean. Similarly, entering a standard turn is sensed by the ear as a climb, and exiting a turn is sensed as a descent.
And I imagine all this fluid sloshing around in sensory conflict has a physical side effect, too.
Yes, motion sickness. It's a severe biological conflict between systems, primarily involving four things: the vestibular system, vision, the proprioceptive system, and the gastrointestinal system. When the eyes say we are still, but the inner ear says we are moving, the body's defense mechanism is to assume it has been poisoned and induce vomiting.
Okay, so if you are flying in a cloud, your senses lie. They are actively working against you, which means the pilot has to rely entirely on their higher cognition, the thinking brain, to override their biological instincts and fly the instruments. But the brain has strict computational limits, too. Let's move to the pilot's mind. How do we process information?
Information processing starts with the first stage, sensory stimulation. But in a cockpit, you are bombarded with millions of stimuli, so your brain must filter it. Attention is defined as the act of detecting relevant information which is not presented in an actively monitored input channel. Your level of attention depends heavily on how automated your behavior is, the salience or importance of the information, and your expectations.
But we can't pay maximum laser focus attention forever. A flight to Tokyo is 14 hours long.
No, we naturally divert our attention as a form of mental relief. But if this happens too much, we suffer from hypovigilance, a severe, dangerous reduction in vigilance. This is brought about by monotony, a lack of stimulation, and fatigue. It is managed by ensuring pilots have continuous aircraft interactions, cross-checks, and scheduled in-flight rest.
What if a pilot is super stressed? Say they have an engine fire. Doesn't the adrenaline make them hyper-vigilant and hyper-aware of everything?
Actually, no. Extremely high levels of arousal or stress are incredibly dangerous because excessive arousal physically narrows your span of attention. You get severe cognitive tunnel vision. You fixate on the burning engine and completely stop monitoring the broader situation, like your altitude or airspeed.
Let's talk about memory, because a pilot has to remember a staggering amount of procedures, radio frequencies, and checklist items.
Human memory has hard biological limits. Working memory, your mental scratch pad, can only hold 5 to 9 discrete items without actively rehearsing them. The absolute maximum is generally considered to be about 7 items. Long-term memory is much larger and is where complex motor programs are kept, but it is highly vulnerable to being affected by expectation and suggestion.
So how do pilots build complex skills to fly a Boeing 777 if their working memory can only hold 7 items at a time?
Through rigorous mental training, mental rehearsal, and cognitive pre-training, it is absolutely crucial to mentally rehearse information and sequences before they are needed to successfully acquire and lock in complex motor skills into long-term memory.
And once it's in long-term memory, experience helps, right? A pilot with 10,000 hours is always safer than one with 1,000 hours.
Experience and repetition can be beneficial, but they can also be incredibly negative.
Negative. How can having more experience be a bad thing?
Because of a phenomenon called environmental capture.
I love this concept. Let's explain this to the listener. It's like when you buy a brand new car and the windshield wiper stock and the turn signal stock are swapped compared to your old car. You have 10 years of experience driving the old car, so you spend the first 2 weeks in the new car turning on the windshield wipers every time you try to change lanes on the highway.
Precisely. Environmental capture is the dangerous psychological tendency for a skill to be executed in an environment in which it is frequently exercised, regardless of whether it's appropriate now. In aviation, it's the tendency for a motor skill acquired in an old aircraft to be reflexively executed in a new aircraft type, even if pulling that specific lever does something completely different and potentially deadly in the new plane.
Let's shift to how the two pilots interact with each other in the cockpit. Communication.
95% of communication on the flight deck is spoken or written, but how it's delivered matters immensely. We have body language, facial expressions, gestures, posture, which convey a lot of unsaid authority or stress, and we have paralanguage.
Paralanguage. What does that mean in this context?
Paralanguage refers to the pitch, tone, and pauses used in speech. Interestingly, the source material specifically notes that paralanguage is how pilots speak to a person who is outside the aircraft, like air traffic control. You can hear the stress or the calm in their tone. Ultimately, the goal of all this communication is to transmit information, which the literature defines formally as being intended to reduce uncertainty. The reduction of uncertainty is mathematically measured in bits.
And the success of that communication heavily depends on who is sitting in the seat, the pilot's personality.
Yes, the industry extensively uses personality tests to screen pilots during hiring. They look at two main psychological axes: introvert versus extrovert, and stable versus unstable, meaning prone to anxiety.
What does the average commercial pilot look like on paper?
Statistically, the average pilot is stable and extroverted, but it's vital to remember that in the cockpit, behavior equals personality plus attitudes, and attitudes are highly malleable. They are influenced by social norms, faith, and national culture.
How does ego play into this? Because there is a stereotype of the hotshot pilot.
Ego is tied to self-concept, which is defined as the way we see ourselves. We all have an ideal self, which is how we deeply want to see ourselves: the hero, the flawless aviator. The difference between your current self-concept and your ideal self is what creates motivation to improve.
But what if you are a pilot who realizes they can never reach that ideal self?
If the ideal self seems utterly unattainable, it causes severe psychological anxiety. Furthermore, if a pilot suffers from a deep sense of underconfidence, it often manifests dangerously in the cockpit as aggression or forced toxic assertiveness to mask their insecurity from the other crew members.
Which leads perfectly into conflict in CRM or crew resource management.
Right. Conflict in the cockpit can be intrapersonal, internal conflict within oneself regarding a decision, or interpersonal, which is conflict between two or more people. In sociological terms, the flight crew is a secondary group, meaning it is impersonal, professional, and temporary, unlike a primary group, which is close-knit, emotional, and intimate like a family.
So how do two strangers who just met in the briefing room an hour ago manage interpersonal conflict at 40,000 feet when the engine fails?
They exhibit one of three main behavioral styles: passive, which is putting the needs and opinions of others first; aggressive, which is putting your own needs and opinions first, regardless of the other pilot; and assertive, which involves active listening, respect, and an assured manner in stating your own observations.
I assume assertive is the gold standard. I want to push back on passive, though. Is being passive always bad? What if you were a junior first officer flying with a 30-year veteran captain? Shouldn't you be a little passive?
No, and that is exactly the culture aviation is fought to eliminate. Passivity is deadly because it allows the captain to fly the plane into a mountain while the first officer watches silently. Assertiveness makes crew decision-making the most effective. The ideal trained state is co-action, which means working in parallel to achieve one common objective. Coordination allows incredible synergy between the pilot and co-pilot, synchronizing their actions and safely distributing responsibilities.
What if a young pilot is super ambitious and aggressively wants to prove their skills to the captain to get a promotion?
Very high ambition and an intense need for personal achievement actually severely disturbs the climate of cooperation. If a conflict arises, say they disagree on whether to divert for whether a democratic and cooperative style is needed, they must try to clarify the reasons and causes of the conflict with all persons involved. CRM, crew resource management, exists explicitly to improve the overall quality of crew performance through these cooperative methods.
But CRM has to constantly fight against specific toxic mindsets that humans bring to the job. The hazardous attitudes. Let's list these for the listener.
There are 5 classic hazardous attitudes taught in aviation. First is invulnerability, which is the deeply held belief that accidents happen to other people, not me, I'm too good. Second is macho, which is a pilot constantly trying to prove they are the best, taking unnecessary risks to show off. Third is anti-authority, which is a reflexive, immature dislike of rules or ATC instructions. Fourth is impulsivity, doing the very first thing that comes to mind without thinking it through. And fifth is resignation, the fatalistic belief that what's the use, nothing I do matters, the plane is going to crash anyway.
Let's assume we have a well-trained, assertive crew who have purged those hazardous attitudes. They encounter a crisis. How do they actually formally make a decision to save the plane?
They follow a highly structured decision-making process. Step 1. Detect. Recognize that a change or failure has occurred. And note, this step is highly susceptible to confirmation bias, the human tendency to only see data that supports what you already believe is happening while ignoring red flags. Step 2. Estimate. Estimate the severity and the need to react. Step 3. Choose. Choose a desired, safe outcome. Step 4. Identify. Identify the solutions available to achieve that outcome. And this step is highly susceptible to something called satisficing.
Satisficing, is that a real word? Like finding a solution that is just satisfactory and sufficing rather than optimal.
Exactly. It means picking the very first workable option that comes to mind, rather than taking the time to find the best, safest option. Step 5 is do. Doing what needs to be done. And a critical note the literature emphasizes here. While doing this complex troubleshooting, someone must ensure someone is actually flying the aircraft.
Right, the classic failure where both pilots get sucked into programming the computer or reading a manual while the plane slowly and perfectly descends into the ocean.
Exactly. Fly the plane first. And the final step is evaluate. Look at the result and see if the decision that was made was actually correct, and change it if it wasn't.
Time must be a huge factor here.
The amount of time available has a massive influence on the psychological analysis of the situation. A pilot should take as much time as they need and is available to make up their mind. Don't rush if you have fuel and altitude. But there is a massive psychological trap in group decision-making. If a pilot's primary emotional intention is being integrated into the team, being recognized as a leader, or simply avoiding interpersonal conflict, they might attempt to agree on decisions made by others, even if they know deep down it's a fatally bad decision.
Think about how wild that is. The human desire to keep the peace, to not rock the boat, and avoid an awkward social interaction with the coworker actually overrides the biological desire to stay alive. It's a terrifying quirk of human psychology. Which brings us to our final section, the ultimate enemy of the pilot's mind, the thing that strips away all the CRM and training, exhaustion, and automation.
Let's talk about fatigue and stress. A human adult biologically requires 8 hours of sleep per night. Sleep architecture is divided into roughly 90-minute cycles.
What actually happens to the brain and body during those 90 minutes?
We transition between phases. We have orthodox sleep, which is deep, slow-wave sleep that provides physical recovery and refreshes the muscles and organs. Then we have paradoxical or REM sleep, rapid eye movement. A healthy human gets 4 to 5 bouts or cycles of this in an 8-hour period, and the duration of REM increases during the latter half of the night. REM sleep is absolutely vital to regenerate mental functions and process memories.
And long-haul commercial aviation completely destroys normal sleep schedules.
It obliterates it. Our bodies have a free-running circadian rhythm of about 25 hours. We operate on a physiological credit and debit system of roughly 12 hours. When pilots cross multiple time zones rapidly, their internal clock desyncs from the sun. They suffer from circadian dysrhythmia, formerly known as transmeridian desynchronization, or what we all call jet lag.
How long does it take the body's internal clock to adapt to a new time zone?
Biological resynchronization takes place at a painfully slow rate of 1 to 1.5 hours a day. Therefore, there is a general operational rule for pilots. If you cross 3 to 4 time zones and only have a 24-hour layover, you should absolutely keep the swing and rhythm of your departure country as long as possible. Don't try to adapt to the local time, because you'll just have to violently switch back tomorrow. Keep your watch on home time.
And if you don't manage this sleep debt, you get profoundly fatigued.
Yes, and fatigue drastically and measurably degrades both mental and physical performance. It is caused by sleep loss, physical exercise, intensely long duty times, poor baseline health, and jet lag. The symptoms are severe in a cockpit, unpredictable mood swings, drastically slow reaction times, a massive increase in errors, short-term memory problems, and visual tunnel vision.
Is all fatigue treated the same medically?
No, we separate it critically into acute and chronic fatigue. Acute fatigue is short-term, caused by a single long-duty day or a bad night of sleep. Crucially, acute fatigue does not have psychological roots. It is purely physical and mental exhaustion that can be cured by a good night's sleep. Chronic fatigue, however, is long-term and is considered the most dangerous state for a pilot. It builds up over months. It's prevented by ensuring a good quality and quantity of sleep over time, regular exercise, a balanced diet, and active stress control.
You mentioned stress earlier when we talked about arousal and tunnel vision. How does the body process stress over a long period?
Stress reactions happen in predictable biological phases. The first is the alarm phase. This brings increased arousal, a dump of adrenaline, and a release of glucose into the blood for quick energy, the fight-or-flight response. However, during this alarm phase, your overall baseline stress resistance decreases. If the stressor continues, you enter the resistance phase. Your body adapts. This phase allows fats to be converted into sugars, prolonging the mobilization of energy in the body to deal with the sustained threat. But if this lasts over a highly prolonged period, the system breaks. The appearance of psychosomatic disorders begins. Your body literally starts breaking down physically due to the psychological burden.
Okay, so the pilot is fatigued, their working memory is limited to 7 items, their inner ear is lying to them about which way is up, and they are stressed. Thank goodness for computers. Let's talk about the final piece of the puzzle, the automation paradox.
Automation is an incredible world-changing tool. It massively reduces pilot workload, it improves landing minima, allowing planes to land in zero visibility, it vastly improves navigational accuracy, and it saves millions of gallons of fuel. But it introduces entirely new, deeply insidious human factor problems.
The cons. What happens when humans rely too much on the computer?
The cons are severe. High reliance on automation causes severely reduced situational awareness. Because the pilot isn't physically flying, they lose track of exactly what the plane is doing in 3D space. It leads to the literal degradation and loss of basic manual flying skills over years. It makes it very hard to make rapid, last-minute changes to a flight plan because reprogramming the flight management computer takes intense heads-down time. Furthermore, the constant barrage of oral and visual alerts from the computer actually reduces critical verbal communication between the pilots, even though that communication is still just as important.
What kind of specific errors do pilots make when interacting with the automation?
One specific, highly studied error is an action mode error, which is the capture of a poor subprogram by the pilot. For example, you tell the autopilot to descend to 10,000 feet, but you accidentally select the mode that descends at maximum vertical speed rather than a gentle, controlled glide. The plane violently dives, technically doing exactly what you told it to do. Then there is mode awareness failure, not knowing what systems are currently active, what they are doing, and what they should be doing next.
I imagine on a 14-hour flight over the Pacific, pilots just zone out staring at the screens. It's like highway hypnosis.
Yes, that is exactly what human factors experts call passive monitoring. Watching the autopilot screens, but not actively, critically thinking about the data being presented. The cognitive attention of the cockpit crew becomes severely reduced, with the consequence of being completely out of the loop when the automation suddenly disconnects and hands them back the airplane in a crisis. This entire dynamic leads to complacency, which the literature strictly defines as an unjustified, dangerous self-confidence in the automated system's ability to handle any situation.
So the autopilot isn't a replacement for the pilot. From everything you're saying, it sounds more like a highly capable, incredibly fast, but painfully literal co-pilot that you can never ever stop supervising.
That is the exact fundamental mitigation strategy taught to modern pilots. You must actively prevent complacency by treating the autopilot not as a machine, but as an additional crew member who needs constant supervision. Automation does not mean you can stop paying attention. Ironically, it requires an increased amount of vigilant monitoring. Ultimately, the overall system quality, its reliability, and its good detectability are the sum of three things. The automatic monitoring happening in the background, the detection and warning facilities designed to alert the crew, and the alerting capabilities of the man-machine interface.
The man-machine interface. Liveware interacting with hardware and software. It all comes right back to the center of the shuttle model we started with. Right. Let's wrap this massive journey up. We have traveled from the sheer, unforgiving biological limits of the human body, the fact that we need 100% oxygen physically forced into our lungs at 40,000 feet just to stay conscious, dealing with nitrogen bubbling in our joints and trapped gases agonizingly expanding in our teeth. We've explored the cognitive limits of a brain that can only hold 7 items in its working memory and an inner ear that can easily, fatally trick us into flying upside down into the ocean.
And yet what is truly magnificent is that despite all of those biological frailties, despite all the hazardous attitudes and psychological traps, the modern aviation system is a triumph of engineering. Through the application of the shell model, crew resource management, the protection of a just culture, and incredibly strict medical dispositions, we have built an ecosystem brilliantly designed to insulate us from our own inevitable fallibility. It fully assumes we will make that 1 in 1,000 slip, and it builds a massive redundant net to catch it before it becomes an undesired aircraft state.
Which leaves me with a final, slightly provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over today as you go about your commute or your workout. As artificial intelligence advances, as automation approaches near-perfect reliability, and as aircraft essentially become capable of flying themselves flawlessly from gate to gate, does the biological human pilot eventually transition from being the ultimate safety net to becoming the ultimate latent error sitting in the cockpit?
Yeah.
Or is that 1 in 1,000 good error rate exactly where human intuition lives? Is the uniquely human ability to creatively break the rules, to adapt to a totally unforeseen catastrophic failure, and to save the plane something a machine can never replicate? Next time you look up at a white jet contrail cutting across a blue sky, remember the wildly imperfect, beautifully adapted human mind sitting at the very front of that aluminum tube, managing the muddy waters.